Hello and welcome to Cargo Shorts, brought to you by Old Dominion Freight Line. I'm your host, Jonathan Betz. Today we're talking about why getting those pallet dimensions spot on is becoming a game changer in the LTL industry. Accurate dimensioning provides downstream benefits to shippers, including improved speed, accuracy, and more predictable pricing. We'll explore how cutting-edge technology, from imaging sensors to big data, is changing the industry by streamlining shipping and boosting the bottom line. Joining us to discuss this is Todd Polen, Vice President of Pricing Systems at Old Dominion Freight Line, and Glenn Zalusky, Vice President of Strategic Business at Rice Lake Weighing Systems, an industry leader in all things measuring and weighing. Thanks to you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Glenn, let's start with you. Give us a big picture overview of what exactly is dimensioning.
Yeah, dimensional weight, which you'll often hear referred to as dim weight, volumetric weight, or cube weight, is the relationship of the cubic size of the palleted item to the actual weight of the item. So a dimensional weight establishes a density factor that defines the size of the freight on a pallet to its weight, which then allows carriers to more accurately price their services.
And why is it so important for carriers?
You could think of the often cited example of shipping large boxes of pillows. Each box weighs very little, but takes up a large amount of physical or cubic space on the trailer. If the carrier was charging the shipper on weight alone, they could actually lose money by hauling that type of freight. Another example might be a 12-foot long plastic drainage pipe. That pallet will take up a lot of dedicated floor space in the trailer and prevent the carrier from stacking freight above it. So while the shipper just sees an 18-inch high piece of freight, the carrier sees the approximately 90 inches of space above it that must be dedicated to that pallet.
And I think that's a key point, correct, Todd? This difference between what the carrier and what the shipper sees with some of this freight. So help us understand why dimensioning is so important for LTL carriers.
I think Glenn made a good point earlier. Historically, carriers, we've always charged customers based on weight. And with the changes in the classification that are coming, cube's going to be the most important thing in determining the class of the freight. So for us, Glenn's pillow examples, it's a good example. Essentially, the customer buying space on our trailer. At the end of the day, we very rarely weight out when our line haul dispatches. It's more of a cube issue, and so for us, making sure that we get paid appropriately for the space on the trailer that we're using, that it's just critical to get that. And there's a second thing, though, as it relates to just what you charge. We have a TP&L system that's based on cube. And when we evaluate pricing and do bids and all these things, capturing that cube data is critical simply because it could be a vertical market. Most pillow manufacturers, the density of the freight's similar. So even if we haven't had experience with, that particular customer, we probably have some pretty good density data along similar vertical markets of products. So it really ties into everything we do and how we literally assign costs and price freight.
And so, Todd, go further on that. Do you feel like the landscape is shifting a bit to focus more on measuring by volume instead of weight?
Yeah, and I think it's better for customers. I'll give you an example. If you have a 500-pound pallet, that's fine. It's nice to know that it weighs that. But if it's still 4 by 4 by 4 and the cubic feet doesn't change and it turns out it's 550 pounds, as a carrier, I would probably balance through the customer for that because I'm getting paid by weight. But if I'm getting paid by cube and the cube hasn't changed, but the weight went up 50 pounds, it's not really affecting me at all in terms of cost allocation. So I think it might actually help the customer in the long run on some of these small changes because it doesn't matter. So I think, and one of customers' pet peeves with the LTL industry in general is freight invoicing, balance dues, corrections. This will help mitigate some of that impact as well.
So, Glenn, let's talk about the technology here. It seems to be pretty sophisticated. It seems to be changing quickly, I imagine. The scanners, the dimensioners that can simultaneously measure and photograph all sides of a load in seconds. Explain to us, how does this technology work?
The dimensioner is essentially a network device. It doesn't have to be. It can be standalone, but you're kind of defeating the purpose if you're not integrating the data to automatically be captured by your servers. Typically, they're ceiling mounted. using, high resolution imaging cameras, and it's combined with some complex algorithms to measure the freight below them. And more importantly, it does it in about 1.5 to 2 seconds. In an LT&O environment, a common process would be the driver identifies the freight via its, pro number or your unique identifier. That's typically accomplished by a barcode scan from the forklift. The weight is captured by the forklift scale, and the driver proceeds to a dimensioner location. Once there, he'll trigger the dimensioner, wait about 2 seconds, and then receive a visual confirmation that the scan was successful, and moves off to complete the cross-dock process.
So it really speeds up the process here, right, Glenn? And how does this compare to the traditional method of measuring by hand?
Yeah, I would title this question, ditch the tape measure. I mean, I've heard some shippers state that they use a tape measure to capture dimensions, and quote, it's more accurate than an automatic dimensioner. If you have perfectly square or cuboid freight out to the edge of the pallet, it might be possible to get close to accurate dimensions with a tape measure. But, I'd stress might be. I've participated in real world studies on freight docks where a tape measure has been compared to an automatic dimensioner, and the results dramatically favor the dimensioner. And if I could, I'd like to list a couple of reasons for that. One is accuracy. The dimensioner is looking at the highest point as well as all sides of the freight. People, when they're rushed, tend to measure with a tape from one side and often miss protrusions or imperfections of things like boxes, maybe that have been moved in some way. Speed, we talked about the 1.5 to 2 seconds that to capture those dims. And you contrast that with the driver getting off the forklift, grabbing a tape measure, which they hope is nearby, stepping back, analyzing the freight, taking 3 measurements, documenting them on paper or entering them into a device such as a tablet. And all that can take 20 to 30 seconds. Safety is something to consider too, because every time a driver gets off a forklift, you increase the risk of a trip, a slip, a fall, that type of thing. Human error. People can be pressed for time, and when they are, they tend to estimate or transpose numbers, and that stuff just doesn't happen with an automatic dimensioner, which is measuring plus or minus half an inch. And then finally, I think compliance. When you make the process easy for your employees, they're more likely to participate. It's a little bit of a rhetorical question, but do dock workers want to kneel down on a concrete floor to try to get the measurements, or simply pause their forklift for 2 seconds under a dimensioner and drive off?
I mean, so it sounds like it's a major change in process, and really streamlines things here. But Todd, how widespread is hand measuring in the industry to this day?
Well, it's still out there because it is the cheapest thing you can do. I think Glenn's correct in all the things he pointed out why it's not the best. It's interesting that I think the biggest challenge is just the cost. When you do that new technology and you buy a dimensioner, okay, now it's a capital expenditure and it's not cheap, but it is more effective and it does save you time. But even that, once you get a dimensioner, you have all these reams of data. So now you're going to have to develop some additional resources, quite honestly, to say, well, what am I going to do with it? I've got it. Now I've got a database. And we need to put a little IT work in so that we can do it by customer or build to, if it's a third party involved, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the future is also going to be customers are going to want this data in real time. So what's going to happen with Glenn's dimensioner, for example, there will probably come a point in the near future where as soon as that dim is done and we've associated it with the pro and it's in our system, there's going to be customers that are going to want that same data, maybe via API. Okay, now let's send it to them. They can update their systems, especially if we find a discrepancy. So I think it's going to be more real time. So I think that's kind of the things that you run into is in terms of, I don't know, the negatives or downstream effects. But clearly, in my mind, the automation piece does save you labor. And if you can get your freight charges to match correctly with the customer and have less discrepancies, nobody wins when you're arguing about the charges on a freight bill. At the end of the day, it's a big drain on everybody.
So Glenn, let me get your response to that about some of the challenges, particularly when it comes to the capital expense, integrating and adopting this new technology into existing management systems. What do you say to that?
Yeah, as Todd pointed out, you often have to have some robust IT to not only getting the data to people is really pretty easy. It uses some complex algorithms and technology the dimensioner does, but fortunately for shippers and carriers, the path to integrate the data is pretty simple. The dimensioner comes with software that collects the images, the weight, the dimensions, obviously, and then kind of neatly packages them and allows carriers to grab that data. And the images that are collected can also contain information such as time and date, the pro number, bill lading number, sequence of skids, such as skid 104, that type of thing. So it simplifies the process utilizing software. But again, you have to be able to manage that quickly in real time.
Todd, it seems like one of the challenges that these dimensioners are solving is the reality that trucks are often running out of space before they reach their weight limit. So give us an idea of just how big of a concern that is for the trucking industry.
I think it's pretty universal as it relates to LTL. We do cube out before we weight out. So there's a secondary benefit here for the trucking industry. We're constantly hounded, by our customers for ESG data and requirements. And if we can get this data in real time before we actually load the truck, there's some programs out there where you can play Tetris with the freight and try to figure out, wait a minute, this trailer's closed out with X amount of cubic feet. That doesn't make sense, right? And so it can also be an efficiency tool for carrier and operations in that regard to make sure that they can plan a little better when they get data in real time with some of this stuff that Glenn's machines can provide us. So it might be able to reduce the number of dispatches that we have if we're more effective and with the cube data. It can definitely help us on the P&D end, because if you have the dimensions by the time you're delivering it, most freight tends to go out on a P&D unit. It's on the floor. So that makes it a lot easier to figure out what you can do and, how many drivers you need and trucks, et cetera, when you're dealing with a P&D. So I think there's some downstream efficiency things that carriers can do with this stuff to improve their operations and become more efficient. And for us, if a truck's burning gas, we're spending money. So if we could do anything to increase our efficiency as an industry as it relates to that, we're all about it. So I think, there's a lot of good things here that once you get away from just a strict pricing impact, there's a lot of good things that the dimensioners can do for the industry and the environment.
You talked about playing Tetris with the cargo, so I wanted to kind of talk about irregular shaped cargo when it comes to trucking and how these dimensioning solutions can help that challenge. How does it help it, Todd?
The main thing is on any delivery too, by the way, I think knowing the dimensions, our goal is to make sure that when we deliver it's delivered that first time. We don't want to bring it back. And I think it will help us with that too, because if you've got something that's odd or irregular shape, you'll be able to better plan for how to deal with it.
Glenn, dimensional weighing, I know used to be a concern really only for air freight, but it is definitely clearly moving to all sectors of commercial shipping. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, you're accurate there. Historically, the cost per square foot of air cargo space has been higher than that on a semi-trailer. Some of that was regulatory. Some of that was just availability. However, the business case behind using dimensional weight is so sound that now carriers of both parcel and freight have adopted it. The technology, if you think about it, scales. The technology to quickly electronically weigh items has been available for decades. And now the availability of automatic dimensioners is entering that same realm as well, where it's both accessible and affordable.
So affordable, let's talk about that and talk about pricing here. So Glenn, first off, how widespread has dimensional weighing become?
It's very widespread in the LTL industry for the reasons Todd noted, and some recent announcements by the NMFTA will only speed adoption by shippers and carriers. Rice Lake is seeing demand grow from a variety of markets. We've installed these obviously with LTL carriers, but now we're seeing the demand from the shipper side. And it's very wide ranging. We've had the Green Bay Packers, NFL Pro Shop install our dimensioners, all the way to auto parts manufacturers, plumbing parts distributors, international postal organizations, anybody that's concerned about space and dimensions. The bottom line is if you're shipping freighter parcels, you need to have your dimensional weights in order because it is affecting your bottom line.
It's absolutely critical, it seems like. So Todd, let's talk about this dimensional weight pricing here. How much of a game changer has that been for carriers to calculate precise shipping charges?
For us, it's slowly getting there. Customers are obviously already doing it on the parcel side. So The transition's a little different. I think the main difference, though, that's somewhat of a roadblock is on the parcel side, they've kind of been conditioned by UPS and FedEx to, they know what the cube is. They know it's going down the conveyor at some of their facilities. They know it's going to be scanned and weighed, and there's going to be a dim weight charge if it, meets the criteria. So everything's automated on their end. And it's a little less on LTL because those same cartons sit on a pallet. So while they may know what those cartons are on the parcel side, once they stack them on a pallet, it's going to be different. So it's getting there. We're ready to do it. We've got 2 different ways to price freight without the NMFC. We just need to know the density, because if it's boxes on a pallet, I don't really know that I care about the class. I do care if it's hazmat, obviously, but ultimately cube is what's going to drive my price. So it's going to take off. I agree with Glenn with the changes in NMFC, because that's the way the industry is going. That's just going to spur things along in the right direction. The odd thing about the NMFC is, 75-80% of the shipments in the book, the primary determining factor in determining the class is density. That's the reason the book exists. You would associate a class with the density and price accordingly. Now that's gone away, and it's just going to be strictly data-driven based on cube. Obviously, there'll still be exceptions for odd things. Could be hazmat stuff, could be flagpoles that, cube's not probably the most appropriate way to allocate costs or derive a price. But, there's a good chunk of that universe, which is about, 75-80% of it is just going to be cube. And, I think that automation is going to benefit everybody, the customer. But, we haven't seen a wholesale move to this yet, but clearly it's coming.
Yeah, the landscape appears to be shifting quickly, right, Glenn? I mean, what do you see coming down the line here? What's the future look like?
Yeah, it's happening rapidly. Again, there's more technology. From a dimensioning standpoint, we've really benefited, ironically, from the autonomous driven car and a lot of the vision systems that have been developed for processes not related to dimensioning, but we've been able to utilize that technology, which has changed very quickly for the better. So I see faster dimensioners. I see more accurate dimensioners. And it just means it's going to benefit both shippers and carriers as well as they get that data quickly into their system. And it's important too to point out that, at least for a shipper, you need to get that data on the front end too. I mean, if you have manufacturing products that have some similarity, you should have known dimensions. You should be dimensioning those objects ahead of time, putting them into your shipping software. And that way, as you build out a pallet, it's going to be much easier, and you're going to be able to provide your customer with accurate shipping costs. I mean, sometimes people use freight estimates, and if I give a freight estimate to my customer of $100 and an LTL carrier changes that to $200, it's very difficult at that point, once I've got the PO, to go back and try to recoup that $100. So it's kind of too late then. So to Todd's point, getting this done on the front end by shippers and carriers will be essential.
So as we look to the future here, Todd, and we look at the overall big impact to shippers, what do you think dimensional weighing means for them in terms of adopting smarter shipping practices and packaging? Well,
there's a couple different ways to look at it. The thing that I think might benefit us too, if you have a customer, for example, that uses a dimensioning shipping system, kind of like what Glenn's got available, but there's others that are NTEP certified as well. If they passed us that data along with the electronic bill of lading or something, and we, of course, we're going to verify, right? Trust, but verify. We're going to scan it as well. Well, once we have a high incidence of trust, we may say, maybe we don't need to dimension these guys. We can kind of accept what they're telling us. It's going to it'll streamline the billing process. We won't have to go through all that. Customer's going to get a bill that they expect, when we actually bill them, and there's going to be less issues and less need for freight payment agents. I think that could be huge, especially as it rolls out in the industry. It's not just carriers having these things. And I also believe that if you just think about, what else is going, Glenn mentioned the dimension in motion. If you start doing drive-through and it can actually back out the forklift, which it can do, and you just see you're also saving time there, and it's going to save time for us and the customer. It's far superior to any manual process where you're relying on a human to either scan a bill code or enter data into another system And that's kind of the neat thing about Glenn's dimensioner. It automatically transmit the data to our computer, for example, and no one's keying it, no one's touching it, no way it gets wrong, unless, of course, you associate it with the wrong pro number. But it takes out a lot of the errors that you would associate with manual intervention, because Mr. Manual just kills you every time.
Yeah, this technology does absolutely seem like a game changer. As you point out, it's all about having good, reliable data. We'll leave it there. Glenn, Todd, great conversation. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That wraps up today's episode on freight dimensioning. When it comes to shipping, every inch counts. Accurate dimensioning can tip the scales in your favor. When weighing your options, precise pallet dimensioning can make shipping faster and more efficient while reducing surprises on your final bill. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our full Cargo Shorts podcast series. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, SoundCloud, and YouTube Music. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review, share with your colleagues, or drop us an email at marketing@odfl.com. Visit the OD Outlook section of the Old Dominion Freight Line website at odfl.com, where you can find additional information on this topic. Thanks for listening.